So my name is Ross Whitaker, and I'm the director of the School of Computing, and we're hosting this event, and I first want to just say welcome to everyone. Thank you all for coming to our Arpanet 50, as we call it. I want to thank the Eccles School of Business for making the space available. It's a beautiful space with lots of great views and amenities and a working HVAC system, which is really important for... So before we really get started, I just want to introduce a couple of sort of special guests who've stopped by. So the first one would be Representative Jeff Stenquist. If you would just raise your hand. Thank you, Representative Stenquist. Thanks for coming. We appreciate it. I should also mention that Jeff is a CS alumni as well, so we're really proud to have you here. Thanks. Now this Arpanet event is, kind of looking backward and thinking some about the history and the legacy of technology, information technology in Utah. And in that regard, I want to point out a very special set of guests we have here. Would you mind standing up? We have 3 generations of Utah computer scientists here. This is Dr. Wendell Pope, Linda Dude-Hadway, and her son Christopher Dude-Hadway. So yeah, welcome. So there's your 50 years of Arpanet. So thanks for coming. So I thought what I would do is take just a few minutes, and kind of think back a little bit to try to put this event in perspective. And so what I want you to do is imagine, or some of you can remember, when computers were these monolithic things, right, that sat in rooms behind glass, typically by themselves, and the 2 most important things in computing are software and data. And to get that software or that data on that computer, you had to come with a magnetic tape or a stack of cards, and that's how we got data and software onto computers. And of course, we don't do that anymore, and I think that's part of what we're here to sort of think about. So this all started to change in the mid-60s. So in 1965, one of the first documented cases of computer sort of communication was 2 computers and MIT talked to each other over a dedicated phone line. And so I think there's an MIT joke in there somewhere, but I'll let you figure that out. But then in sort of the later 60s, ARPA, the DoD research branch, contracted BBN to start developing the kind of underlying technology for what would become Arpanet. And part of that technology, the key piece of all this, that time was this sort of packet switching strategy, right? So this idea of being able to use nodes and break data into pieces and move it around in a way that was scalable, so that you didn't have to just have 2 computers on a shared phone line. And so it was in 1969 that ARPA developed the plan to go ahead and build this network, and they put together contracts, and if you look at your agenda, at your brochure, you'll see on the back of that thing is a diagram of that first network that was planned, and it was called Arpanet. It had 4 nodes. The first 2 nodes were between SRI and UCLA. Those are the 1 and 2 on that diagram. And the first successful communication on that network was a student, Charlie Klein, at UCLA, and he transmitted the message LO to SRI. So the question I have for you is, what was the purpose of LO? And the answer is, he was trying to type login, and the machine at SRI crashed in the middle of that communication. So that was the first successful communication. He did eventually log in, and that network grew to 4 nodes, and so in December of 1969, Utah became the first node on what they called Arpanet, which is this scalable general architecture for networking computers across long distances. And it was the first node, of course, outside of California. Now from there, lots of things happened, and I won't go into a lot of details, but I want to just share, if you don't mind, just a few little stories that you might like. So in 1970, the ARPANET went to the East Coast, It made connections to Boston and BBN in Boston. In 1972, the email protocol was invented. So that was the first time that there was a systematic way of sending email. In 1973, that net went international with University College London in 1973 already. And then in 1974, Cerf and Kahn proposed and documented what they called TCP, which is that kind of documented protocol that now still forms the underlying software infrastructure of the internet. And so once that protocol was established, this became an open technology. People could build their own, people could connect, and so forth. So now it's hard, it's hard to think about the internet and email and so forth without thinking about spam. All right. So in 1978, a marketing person from Digital Equipment Corporation sent out the first mass email on the Arpanet. Several hundred people got the same email. And it was greeted, not surprisingly, with widespread consternation, okay? Now, it wasn't called spam at the time, okay? This is a new thing. This whole idea that you could just send out hundreds and hundreds of messages with a button click, that was a new concept. So then the birth of the sort of origins of the word spam, so I think most people would put it sort of in the early 90s. In 1994, so remember Usenet news groups, in 1994, 93, I think, there was a bug in a Usenet posting. And this person, instead of posting a single message, ended up posting hundreds and hundreds of messages to this news group. And of course, the computer people who were, inevitably Monty Python fans, saw this, and they were reminded of the repeated nature of the famous sort of Monty Python spam skit. And so they said, this looks like the spam skit. So how many people know the Monty Python spam skit, right? So, right, to remind you, right, the skit goes like this. A couple goes into a restaurant, and the restaurant, it turns out, serves nothing but spam. So every item on the menu is spam. And so the wait person is reading off the menu, and the reading the menu is just spam, 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 right? And then we know as well there's a table full of Vikings who then starts singing along with this, and that's called the spam song, right? So this is the craziness of Monty Python, but it's also where we get the word spam. Now here's the cool thing about all this. It turns out that Arpanet's not the only 50th anniversary that's being celebrated this year. What's the other anniversary?
Landing on the moon.
Monty Python's Flying Circus, 50 years ago this year. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't see how that could possibly be a coincidence, okay? There's something bigger at play here. So with that, I think we can move on to the rest of the program. So let's see. So we have a couple of speakers. The lineup this evening is we have a couple of speakers from the university who are going to share some thoughts and perspectives on this event and the university and the state of Utah and so forth. And I'll introduce them, and then we have our guest speakers as well, who we'll introduce after that. So the first person I want to introduce is my good colleague and boss, Dean Richard Brown, Dean of the College of Engineering. So.
All right, we're up. I'd like to add my greetings to all of you to this event, to that Ross has said. It's wonderful to have such loyal alums and friends of the university here. I've just got to tell you one story that came to mind as Ross was talking. I'd been here only a year or two when Vint Cerf came to give a talk at the university. And I remember him coming into my office, and he was holding in his hand a list of many of our CS alumni. And he said to me, "Rich, I know all these people." He said, "The University of Utah has done more for computing than Berkeley or Stanford or MIT. How can I help you get the word out? I thought that was a pretty nice comment on the University of Utah. Anyway, there have been a lot of great accomplishments here, and we're really proud of the legacy that we have. As Ross mentioned, we're celebrating being the 4th node on the Arpanet. I was at UCLA a couple of years ago when we had an Pac-12 engineering deans meeting, and we took a tour that included the room where that computer still sits that sent that first message on the Arpanet. And they still have hanging on the wall an old style computer printout that has this drawing that's in your program of the first 4 nodes. Dave Evans and Ivan Sutherland, as you know, were the pioneers of computer graphics and were very involved in making Utah the 4th node on the internet. And I've often thought that these people would have been proud to know what's happened at the University of Utah since they were here. In fact, I know for a fact that Ivan Sutherland is, because he was here 2 years ago to speak at Steve Jacobson's memorial service, and he was simply astounded at what had happened at the University of Utah since then. But there have been a lot of other related accomplishments that I thought you'd be interested to briefly see. Tom Stockham did the first digital recordings of sound that led to all of the digital music we had. I think you all know the name Ed Catmull, who was a computer animation pioneer. Alan Kay, who got the Turing Award, by the way, developed the first personal computer, the first graphical user interface, and the first object-oriented language. Here's one you may not know. Frank Wanless, who's a University of Utah grad, has a single inventor patent on CMOS, which is pretty significant technology these days. And of course, you know John Warnock, who completely revolutionized digital publishing, and Jim Clark came up with the first, one of the first commercial browsers, Netscape, as well as founding Silicon Graphics. So there have been a lot of wonderful things that have come out of the University of Utah. And in terms of what's happened since then, I thought since many of you are alums, you'd be interested to see how engineering has grown in recent years at the university. This chart shows the enrollment in all of the colleges at the U, and the red line there is engineering, which has obviously gone up. As a matter of fact, since I came to the U in 2004, the total undergraduate enrollment at the university has gone up by 1,701 students. 2,332 of those were College of Engineering students. We represent 100% of the growth, and we backfilled another 631 positions. Now, our president, Ruth Watkins, has a goal of growing our enrollment to 40,000, and I'm an enthusiastic supporter of that. I can guarantee you that in order to make that happen, a lot of those new students will be in the College of Engineering, and particularly in computer science. As a leading indicator, this plot shows how many freshmen have come into engineering. That's the orangish bars, and the red dots show what percentage of the university's freshman class came into engineering. So when I came, we were getting 7% of the students coming into engineering. It's up to 20% now. And while we've grown considerably, the quality of the students has also gone up. This shows average ACT scores, which have gone up 3 whole points over that period of time. And the net result, which makes people like Lieutenant Governor Cox and Damian Patton very happy, is we have tripled the number of graduates in the college. And I want to take just a minute to thank our legislators and other government officials for the wonderful support, for the vision they had to grow engineering and computer science, which has had a lot to do with the growth of our high-tech economy. Again, since I came 15 years ago, we've hired in the College of Engineering 142 tenure-track faculty. We've grown the number of women faculty from 5 to 37, and everything else has grown with this. For example, we've gone from 398 peer-reviewed publications to over 900 now per year. Our student body has diversified a lot over this period of time. We have more than quadrupled the number of women students in the college and essentially doubled the percentage of women students, which puts us at the national average now. And for minority students, we've gone from 400 to 1,375, so from 20 to 32% of our student body. You've probably heard that the University of Utah is well known for entrepreneurism. A couple of years ago, the Milken Institute did a study of all of the universities in North America, and they concluded that the university that was best at commercializing research results was the University of Utah. I like this quote. The University of Utah has quietly evolved into one of the most prestigious research universities in the United States, with a strong emphasis on commercializing its research. We're all familiar with the term Silicon Slopes. One of the results of the growth of the workforce for high tech has been a change from, in the year 2000, 1,500 high-tech companies to now about 6,700 in Utah. And if you look at tech employment growth on this chart, you'll see the line that ends up at the top is Utah. This goes back to 2010. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics says that Utah has the fastest growing tech sector in the country. Not the biggest by any means, but it is the fastest growing. And our faculty have done a terrific job in research as well. We've gone from $30 million a year to over $95 million a year. But there's still room for growth. This chart shows the number of engineering and computer science students in each of the Pac-12 schools. And you'll notice that the University of Utah is next to last. And if you look at it in terms of percentage of their student body that's in engineering, we're third to last. So I think given that we are in the fastest growing tech sector in the country, there's still plenty of headroom for us to grow. So in summary, all of us, alumni and friends of the University of Utah, are very proud of the U's legacy in computing. And computing will continue to improve productivity and the quality of life as it has done over the past 50 years. Utah as a state has a very bright future in technology. And the College of Engineering is going to continue to grow in quality and in the number of graduates. There are currently over 3,000 open jobs in Utah for computer scientists and engineers. And in order to grow, we're going to continue to need more physical space. So don't be surprised, you alums, if we come to you before too long to ask for your support for a new computer science building, which is one of our next major goals. So thank you for being here, and congratulations to all of you for the great careers that you've had that have helped to build the reputation that computer science has at the University of Utah.
Thanks, Rich. Next, I would like to introduce our Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs, Dan Reed. Dan is, I should say, a computer scientist by training, and many of us have known Dan or known of him for years, in part for his online presence and his leadership at NCSA. And so with that, let me introduce HPC Dan.
I want to sort of take us back and take us forward a little bit and think about, as Ross did just a little bit, the past and the future. So imagine a world where talking to someone on the other side of the planet required you to burn Andy Jackson's $20 bills every couple of minutes. That hasn't been that long ago, right? And today one can speak to essentially anyone on the planet for free. Maybe a little less exciting, imagine a world where Twitter shapes our national political discourse rather than reasoned debate. That may not be the most positive thing, but it's certainly a social change that technology's wrought. But also imagine a world where, with the touch of a button on your smartphone, you can order goods and services from around the world and sometimes have them delivered later that day, but for sure tomorrow morning. And these are all things that began with the birth of the Arpanet. And I want to take just a quick fancy ramble through that history and maybe talk a little bit about what might come in the future. But Ross told you that it's the 50th anniversary of Monty Python. Rich Brown rightly noted it was also the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11 and the lunar landing. But here are a few other things to remember. The Boeing 747 first flew in 1969. The Vietnam War was raging with the associated protests. Martin Luther King had just been assassinated just a year before. Tensions in the US were high. And Jimi Hendrix changed the notion of what guitar player was forever at Woodstock. All of those things happened in 1969. Here are a few other things to sort of put things in perspective. Intel had just been founded. So, and AMD was founded in 1969. So the two companies that are responsible for the microprocessors that have driven almost everything in the consumer revolution, those companies had just been founded. Those of you who are geeks and care about Unix or Linux, AT&T Bell Labs just started working on that. And in a story that was to become all too repetitive, Xerox advanced the laser printer, but they don't bring it to market first. That would be IBM. And that was a repeated story of great ideas that never quite made it to the market. So being first mover in a new idea isn't enough. You actually have to have a good and successful business plan to deliver it. I was a young teenager filled with teenage lust, but the thing I was lusting for was on the bottom left. Which was arguably one of the first personal computers. This was the MITS Altair 8800 in 1974. It sold for about $1,200 in current dollars. That was wildly beyond my childhood reach, but was the beginning of many things. About the same time, Microsoft was founded and shipped BASIC, which really made that machine the first sort of a hobbyist computer. And Apple shipped the Apple II, which sort of went mainstream in terms of consumer PC-type technology in 1977. So a lot has changed in 50 years. And here's something I want you to think about. This person perhaps single-handedly deserves credit for what became the internet. He was known in Defense Department circles as Lick, JDR Licklider. He had a vision that began in the 1950s, and it was the driving impetus for the people who ultimately created the Arpanet. And I'm not going to read all of this, but the part in italics is important. In 1960, he said, this picture of a set of connected thinking centers enlarges itself into a network, connected to one another by wideband communication lines and to individuals. This is 1960, so almost 10 years before what I just told you. So here's a question I want you to think about. What idea might you have that 60 years from now, people would still consider prescient? That's a pretty tall order. So there were some really visionary people who drove this early technology, because as Ross said, people were building what became the internet out of multi-million-dollar devices. And in order to allocate that resource, it took a leap of faith about what could be possible. And so one thing I want you to walk away from here thinking about the University of Utah, the 50th anniversary of the birth of the Arpanet, is the thing that always drives change are culture and people of vision. There is no substitute for those. And that's been true here for a long time, and I have zero doubt it will continue to be true into the future. So let's talk a little bit about the beginning. This is the picture, of course, that's on the program tonight. You can see in the middle what was the standard machine of the day, and you can gauge the size there with the chair in front of it. And over on the right is a machine that Rich alluded to. This was what was called an interface message processor. It was what we would now think of as a router that you would go to Best Buy and pick up for a handful of bucks. That was the machine that routed messages from location to location. And it was custom software to support the packet routing that allowed communication among those nodes. And it was the evolution of that technology that continues to serve us today. Now, I was telling someone earlier today that I, like some of you, are old enough to actually remember when I knew a significant fraction of the people on the planet who had an email address. Maybe that means I'm old, I don't know, but it hasn't been that long ago. What really happened after '69 is an interesting story. So the Arpanet continued to expand, and you can see what one of the successor networks, the National Science Foundation Network, looked at in 1991. It still connected Utah. This network began to connect a series of research computing centers that the National Science Foundation funded in the late 1980s. One of those was at the University of Illinois, where I spent a large fraction of my career. And that group built a series of software packages that really changed the world and built on what had happened before. And the goal they were trying to pursue was how to support a distributed group of people across the country who wanted to work together and do so electronically. They built a whole series of software tools, all of which failed. One of the ones that failed was called Collage. The one that succeeded finally was called Mosaic, and that was the first successful web browser. And that was really the birth of what became the dot-com boom. And as Rich Brown mentioned earlier, Jim Clark swept into Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, hired all the people who worked on Mosaic, and founded Netscape. That's how it began. And ironically, I found myself years later at Microsoft, and the other part of the story is Microsoft was dealing with the effects of the consent decree about browser competition with Netscape. But a lot happened in that period. Some of you may remember, if you flew on an airplane, it was almost impossible not to get a 3.5-inch diskette along with your peanuts and soft drink for free time on AOL Online with dial-up modems at 9600 baud. Hasn't been that long ago, folks. And then there's what happened after all of that. So anyone remember irrational exuberance? So this is the phrase that Alan Greenspan used to talk about the exploding NASDAQ over-the-counter trading in tech stocks, right? And that was, you can see what happened. And I want to tell you one salutary story about a company called pets.com. The web domain still exists, but the company bears nothing to do with the original pets.com. The idea, as you would expect, was to sell pet food online, which at the time was about as successful an idea as saying, we'll sell you concrete blocks and we'll deliver them via FedEx. It was just about that successful a business model. They went public. They raised $92 million. The stock opened at $22 a share. When they went bankrupt, it was trading at 22 cents a share. And they failed one fundamental business dictum. You really need to make money when you sell things. They lost money on every bag of dog food they shipped. But there was a germ of a really good idea in there, and that is really what led us to what has become .com 2.0. Now, I will say Pets.com spent $20 million on a Super Bowl ad, and they did achieve brand penetration. The thing that they managed to sell was their sock puppet. That is the one thing that persisted even though the dog food sale didn't really work. And since then, of course, we've just seen an explosion of everything as a service. And that has really rocked our world. So if you've done an Airbnb, if you've ordered anything from Amazon, if you're doing software development or communication with Slack, if you've taken an Uber, all of these are the successors of that early .com boom and success. And after the early irrational exuberance, the really valid business model emerged. What made it happen was broadband that was just barely available, because people were buying stuff with modems and shared phone lines at the time, turned into universally available wireless communication, smartphones, and a whole bunch of back-end technology. That's really the revolution that's changed our world. And of course, Utah is a part of that. As Rich said earlier, Utah is really rocking it in terms of technology companies that have built on the beginnings of the Arpanet. And a lot of wonderful things are happening here because of those early pioneers. Now, of course, today, everything is connected and smart, with both the promise and the perils that go with that. The Internet of Things is all the rage. So if you have a smart doorbell or a smart camera, or you've been talking to Alexa or Siri, you're taking advantage of that next generation technology. Privacy issues, protection, digital equity, the social issues have come to the fore with the technology. So one of the things I want you to think about as we go forward is technology really does change the world. But with the technology comes the responsibility to think about how we want to use it. Because technology by itself is neither good nor bad, it simply is. And it's incumbent upon us to think about how we want to use it wisely. And so lots of amazing things have happened. But if we look forward, we've seen, as Rich talked about, 50 years of innovation. There are an equally amazing set of things going on at the U right now in terms of wireless communication. You'll hear a bit about that later. In terms of graphics and gaming, scientific visualization, computational modeling, and a host of other things. All of that grew out of that early prescient notion that betting on people, betting on culture, betting on the future is really where we have to go. Which brings me really to the last couple things I want quickly to say to you, which is we now live, by virtue of what happened 50 years ago, in a global, interconnected economy. It's no longer the case that what happens in one part of the world happens in isolation. It propagates at the speed of light across the planet. What it has done is put a premium on a technologically savvy workforce. The parts of the world that succeed are the places that invest in their people, because in a knowledge economy, that is the renewable natural resource, the trained talent of a society's people. And one of the things that we are investing heavily in at the U, in partnership with the state and those of you who support us, is in educating the next generation of talent. And Rich talked a little bit about that, but the number of unfilled tech jobs, people with college degrees and without, is exploding. And an informed populace who can fill those jobs and invent the future is what will define the next 50 years. And so my promise really to you as the Chief Academic Officer of the U is that we are committed to building that future. And one of the things that we've launched, partnership with state support, collaboration with the private sector, is a broad-based informatics initiative to support the next generation of worker training, of workforce development, and education around informatics, both to provide the workforce that's needed in the state, but also to continue to generate the next generation of innovation that will power new companies. That's really the social compact and the commitments that we make to you. And also, I will end by leaving you with this thought. Rarely do the big questions change, but the approaches and the answers do, because in a technologically driven society, how we make those choices depends on looking at what's available. The smartphone you have in your pocket is really no different than the technology those innovators used 50 years ago. There's nothing it really does that those devices didn't do 50 years ago. But they're millions of times faster, thousands of times cheaper, and that quantitative change always drives qualitative change. And so as we think about those qualitative changes derived from quantitative change, it's important for us to be thoughtful about how we build the next 50 years. So let me say again, congratulations to the folks who began this, the folks who've continued this effort for the last 50 years, and I look forward, I hope I'm around to see the 100th anniversary celebration, and I hope you are too, because the future is really bright. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dan. And so our third speaker from the university is President Ruth Watkins.
Okay, so I'm not a computer scientist. And what a tough act to follow here, the computer science folks. I really want to use the occasion to welcome you, to thank you for joining us this evening, and particularly to recognize excellence in our College of Engineering and our School of Computing. How proud we are of you all, current students, alums, those that have affiliated with the University of Utah, for making innovation and discovery happen, for driving excellence, for the creativity that it takes to develop initiatives like Arpanet. It is a remarkable thing that this is part of the University of Utah legacy, and one that we're so proud of. Congratulations. We commend you for the accomplishments that you've had and the vision that it took to drive that forward. I also really would like to thank our partners from the state and from industry who are with us tonight. We are grateful for what you do to help us keep this spirit moving. We like to say that not only are we the University of Utah, we're the University for Utah. We think that's true, but I can see here tonight we are also the University for the world because of the impact of the kinds of discovery and innovation that we're celebrating now. Now, as we look forward to that bright future that Dan was just talking about, I want to tell you about one thing that I think is quite important. Many of us have been in conversations about what it means to be a literate citizen. I think we like to think of ourselves as literate citizens. Now, as we imagine, what does it mean to be a literate citizen in the 21st century? I think it means that you have basic digital competence, that every student has these skills, not just computer scientists and engineers, but there is some floor that every educated citizen, that every graduate of the University of Utah should reach. And we are working to do that. There are several people in the room that are helping us extend digital literacy, basic competence to every student at the U. One of the ways we're doing that is there is taking shape not too far from here, I'll point that direction, a brand new residence hall on our campus that will have nearly 1,000 beds. It opens next summer, 992 beds to be exact, really designed to serve first-year students. That large residence hall has 3 themes. The whole residence hall is called CalArt Village. One of the thematic areas that will be about 330 beds is women in STEM. In that residence hall facility, we will have Mike Kirby and others who have helped develop a course that is basic computing for all, computer science for everyone will be taught there. Students will have tools, learning opportunities, ways to gain certificates and competence in digital literacy that are accessible for first-year students. I think it's a remarkable thing. It is an indication that the University of Utah wants to stay on the forefront of education for literate citizens in the 21st century. I'm thrilled to be able to tell you about it and to celebrate it as part of the broader vision that I think way back in 1969 was taking shape, and some big vision about what it would mean to be an educated person in 2019. Thanks for the opportunity to be with you tonight, and congratulations to all.
Thanks, Ruth. Okay, so with that we begin the guest speaker part of our program, and we'll have 3 guest speakers this evening to give their perspectives on what they're doing and how it might be related to the Arpanet celebration, and thoughts on technology and the state of Utah. The first speaker is our the Lieutenant Governor of the great state of Utah, Spencer Cox. Lieutenant Governor Cox is a graduate of Utah State University, where he obtained a bachelor's degree in political science and was awarded Student of the Year with a 4.0 average. I'm sorry to embarrass you, but this is the kind of stuff we do here. Exactly. He has a law degree from Washington and Lee University. He began his political career in Fairview, Utah, where he was mayor. In 2008, he was elected as the San Pete County Commissioner. Lieutenant Governor Cox was elected to the Utah House of Representatives in 2012. And in 2013, Governor Herbert selected him as the Lieutenant Governor of the state. Lieutenant Governor Cox has been a champion for transforming education through IT technology and for preparing Utah's workforce for this globalized economy, and for modernizing employment by advocating for telework and for IT technology in the public and private sector. So with that, I'd like to welcome Lieutenant Governor Cox to the stage. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a privilege to be here with you tonight. Thank you so much for asking me to come. Rich and Dan, thank you for your presentations. They were very illustrative of what I would like to speak about tonight. I want to thank President Watkins. I know she had to leave for hosting us tonight. And I'm glad to see so many of you. I regret that this room isn't all the way full. I think we could have doubled it. If they had told everyone that there was going to be bacon, I think we would have gotten more people here. So we're the lucky ones that made it. I want to share just a little bit about why this matters and kind of where we go from here, the future of this, with a little of my personal background included in there. I did go to Utah State University. I appreciate that. I did major in political science. I did go to law school, and there's a very distinct reason that I went there. And first of all, I should back up. My dad told me that if you're ever offered the opportunity to give a speech to a room where you're the dumbest person in the room, you should always say no. And yet here we are, which leads me to the second part of my story, and that is I went to law school because the LSAT is the only advanced test that does not have math involved. And you laugh, but it's very true. That's why I went to law school, because there was no math involved. Disappointing my father, because I have to back up a little bit. Although I was born and raised on a farm that my great-great-great-grandfather settled about 160 years ago, my great-grandfather started the Fairview Telephone Company in 1919. Now, that's not quite true. He didn't start the company in 1919. He bought it from 4 farmers who started it in 1903, when the predecessor to the Ma Bell refused to bring telephones to the small town of Fairview. They stopped in Mount Pleasant. And so these enterprising 4 farmers got their horses and their carts and cut down some trees for poles, bought some wire, stretched that wire out to Fairview, where the 4 of them had the first 4 telephones in Fairview. In 1919, some 16 years later, my grandfather bought that company from them, a company that exploded from those original 4 telephones to 25 telephones in those intervening 16 years. They had about 2 employees at the time. That company has remained in our family ever since, as it was passed down from generation to generation. Unfortunately, my grandfather got the farm, and his brother got the telephone company. We got the bad end of that deal. Fortunately for my family, when my grandfather died and we had to sell the dairy cows, my great uncle, hired his nephew, my dad, and gave him some ownership in the company. And my dad and his first cousin ran the company from there. All the way up until the 1980s, when it had exploded from those original 2 employees to approximately 5 employees in 1983. A lot of bootstrapping going on in this startup, this 90-year startup. I had the opportunity, again, my father being very disappointed in me going to law school and working for a large law firm in Salt Lake City. He called and said, hey, how would you like to take a huge cut in pay, come back and raise your kids on the farm and help me run the telephone company, as I will be retiring soon in the next few years. I think it would be a great opportunity for you. Having realized that I had made a huge, colossal mistake in going to law school, I decided that that was the right move for me at the time. I got a chance to move back and to run the company in 2003. Now, the good news is in those 20 years, from 1983 to 2003, the company was thriving. They had acquired many other small telephone companies in places you probably have not heard of, like Schofield, Utah, Eureka, Utah, Goshen, Utah, Wendover, Utah, which you've probably not heard of, but you've heard of Wendover, Nevada. It's the poorer side where people don't have much money and the telephone company is much smaller. We also had the thriving population of Garden City, and that's how the company had expanded, and now had about 40 employees in various locations across the state. My job in 2003 was to figure out exactly what this telephone company would do in the coming years when people would stop having telephones on their walls. We had gone into dial-up internet and had started to explore this new opportunity of broadband with DSL to our phone customers, and I had an epiphany after about a year there that the internet was going to be something even bigger than we imagined in 2003, and that eventually everyone would have high-speed internet and it would do just about everything we wanted to do. I remember traveling around the state and giving speeches to very smart people and telling them that in a coming day, not too far away, that their television and everything that they consumed media-wise would happen via the internet. I saw many eye rolls. I was laughed out of some rooms and told that that would likely not be the case anytime soon. But we decided to make a big bet, that we would bet that everyone would want high-speed internet and that everyone would want as much internet as we could possibly give them. That pipe to their home and that pipe to their businesses should be as big as it could possibly be. And every decision we made in the intervening years was to make sure that we had as much of that pipe as possible and that pipe was as large as possible. I'm happy to report, although I am no longer involved with the company at all, thanks to Governor Herbert 6 years ago asking me to do this, that we now have about 120 employees, and many of those new big businesses that you mentioned, those new big buildings in Lehi, are actually running on fiber optics coming right out of Little Fairview, Utah. And so this has this 50-year anniversary of Arpanet plays an important role in our family. But it's also caused me, again, to reflect on what we thought the internet was going to be, what it is, and what it should or could be going forward. Now, in those early days, as I thought back, I remember graduating from high school in 1993. I went to Snow College for a year and started to understand a little bit about the internet. We had these predecessors to chat rooms, and I was doing some intense research on the band U2 and their musicography over the past several years, and that's what I was using it for then. I went to Mexico for 2 years as a missionary, where I would communicate with my parents, writing letters and asking questions that would take 2 weeks to get to them, and then another 2 weeks to be answered back to me. Not knowing that back home there had been major advancements in this technology called email. Not knowing what that was until I got back to the United States in 1996, and I remember very distinctly sending my first email and logging on to something called the World Wide Web that I logged on to import importantly, again, this is important research to learn about some new Star Wars movies that were going to come out, not realizing that they would be totally ruined by the presence of one Jar Jar Binks, but still, nonetheless, learning from at that very early stage how important this internet could be in my life. Now, in those heady days, we thought about how it could change the world. This concept that all of the knowledge that has ever existed in the history of mankind could be accessible in one location to anyone. Not only that, but the reverse would also be true. The democratization of information and opportunity, that everyone, regardless of wealth, regardless of status, regardless of birth, regardless of geography, would have the opportunity to present themselves to the world. Anyone could be a best-selling author. Anyone could create their own music and share it with the world and be successful. And we would all have access to a common set of facts, that for the first time, everyone across the world would know what real truth is, and we would be able to access it at any time and at any moment. And yet here we are. We are now in a place where we do have access to all of these things, and we have the opportunity to share ourselves with the world. We choose mostly to do it with memes of cats, but there are other things that have happened during that time. This idea of a shared facts and shared truth could not be further from the truth. In fact, we are further from shared facts and shared truth than maybe we have ever been before. We have figured out that this access to everything means we have to pick and choose what we actually consume. And instead of picking and choosing the things that are best for all of us, we pick and choose the things that tend to verify our own worldview. We're able to surround ourselves with voices and information that matches everything we think of the world, to never have to be challenged by anything that might be different than what we see the world to be. We have more friends than ever. But we're lonelier than any group, than any population in the history of the United States. We have these faux friends that allow us to share pictures of our perfect lives with each other, and assuming that everyone else's is completely true while ours is absolutely false, and which leads us to this juxtaposition in life where we have fewer real friends, people we can share our hopes and dreams with, than ever before. But at least we can hate the same people together online, and we find ourselves in tribes, and we find ourselves more divided than perhaps we have ever been. It is also leading to, again, this incredible explosion in our economy, something that we should all be very excited about, and something that Utah has taken advantage of, as you saw the numbers that Dan presented earlier. Very impressive, and something that we should be very proud of. At the same time, though, we know that the future is daunting. We are about to enter an epoch in history that I believe will lead to some of the greatest social change and upheaval, change that will make the Industrial Revolution look like child's play by comparison, as we lead to automation in the workforce, additional automation, the likes of which we haven't seen before, as we lead to artificial intelligence and the end results of what that might be. We are at a very dangerous and exciting time. This can go multiple ways. We know that we're going to destroy jobs. The number one occupation in 37 states right now is driver. It's top 5 in every state. So Uber driver, truck driver, taxi driver, bus driver, all of those things. And yet, because of this very technology, we know that in the next 10 to 15 years, 2/3 of those vehicles will be driving themselves. What do we do with those millions of drivers? Are they going to come to the University of Utah to get a bachelor's degree and take on debt to do that? I submit to you that they won't. What do we end up with? Well, we've seen a sliver of that. If you go to coal country, what happens when the old economy leaves us and the new economy doesn't quite find us yet? We see opioid addiction skyrocketing. We see suicide rates that are sometimes double the state and national average. Deaths of despair because of this exciting and amazing change change that has left real human beings behind. And so there is a piece of this as we look at what goes forward that we must consider, and that I hope that the bright people here will consider. What do we do with this social change? This is why we must get out of our silos, that the engineers must work next to the sociologists here at the school, that we must understand the real repercussions of these incredible advancements that can do more to save human life and yet have led to the loss of human life. We have seen the actual decrease in the longevity of white males in our country for the first time in many, many generations. Now, the future is very exciting. We're talking about 5G and what's going to happen. Imagine someone here at the University of Utah performing surgery on a patient in rural Utah where I live remotely. The opportunities for that type of advancement are real and are going to happen sooner rather than later. It's really incredible. We can use it to do that. We can use it to communicate. We can use it to lift human beings. We can also use it to tear each other down. I used to worry about my Twitter account, and then we got a new president, and now I'm not worried anymore. I'm not going to get fired for my Twitter account. I know that. Again, how we use this technology matters to all of us. And I hope as we celebrate the incredible advancements that we've made over the past 50 years, that we look cautiously but with hope to the next 50 years. Thank you so much for what you've done to make Utah a better place. Congratulations and good luck on the next 50. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lieutenant Governor Cox. Our next speaker is Damian Patton. He is the founder and CEO of Banjo. Banjo is one of the nation's leading AI companies. It's focused on using technology to deliver live, validated information for people to make faster and better decisions. Damian Patton is a military veteran of Desert Storm and a former crime scene investigator. And he draws on these life experiences to help achieve Banjo's mission of saving lives and reducing human suffering by using their technology for the good of everybody. So let's hear his perspective on technology.
Good evening. As I was listening to Lieutenant Governor Cox, it reminded me of a few things that I wasn't going to share tonight, and now that I will, so thank you for teeing that up. And I'll get to that in a minute. About 2 years ago, when I came to this state to live from Silicon Valley, I didn't know that Utah and the University of Utah played such an important role in what we're all here for tonight. I didn't know of all the innovation that had come through this state and through this university that we were able to see a few speakers ago. I didn't know of all the things that were going on here with Silicon Slopes because I was so embedded in Silicon Valley. I just didn't know. And I'm lucky enough that my wife came to me one evening at home in Palo Alto and said, we're moving, and we're moving to Park City. And I said, Utah? I don't think so. Obviously I lost, and we are here. And the company I have, Banjo, many of you probably have not heard of it, and we plan it that way. We keep very quiet, but we're probably much larger than you imagine. We were born in Silicon Valley, but we are now raised here in Utah. And something that was exciting for me to see, and I did not even know just when Dean Brown was talking about how the state of Utah is, I think, 7th largest in VC funded states. I'm hoping now that we're adding to that because while it's not public, it will be soon, that we just raised an additional $110 million to be spent mostly here in Utah over the next 3 years. So, yeah, thank you. So I want to talk about a little bit about the future. The internet is obviously very important to all of us. If I want to be completely transparent about it, it's very important to me for a lot of reasons. Number one, it's because the way I met my wife a long time ago before there were dating sites online, but that's a longer story of when I was hacking back in the days of the discs that we got from AOL. But it's been important to all of us. But as Lieutenant Governor started talking about the dangers of the internet and about the dangers of AI, it's not meant to scare people. It's just meant for us all to come together to have at least a dialogue and a conversation. I've decided to spend my time in technology and my company and my life dedicated to helping others and truly saving life with artificial intelligence and data and not using it for other means. But there's a bigger dialogue to have around the ethics and morals around how we are going to guide this future. And it is about getting sociologists to unsilo with technologists. It's a getting to unsilo, period. And in fact, that's what our company a decade ago was founded on. It was about unsiloing data that had never been unsiloed and synthesized together before for the purposes of being able to discover things live, truly live, that are happening. And we built a new type of distributed system that can truly process the world of live data, whether it's videos or audio or text or IoT, synthesizing it all together, all these disparate systems, to find the needle in the haystack, to focus our attention live on matters most. For example, like tragedies like the Vegas shooting. We just celebrated is a bad term, but we celebrated in the fact of the 2-year anniversary of what happened in Vegas, and therefore the technology that'll be used to ensure that things like this don't happen in the past, the tragedy of the mass shooting down there. And it was technology that we can use today by unsiloing data that would have pinpointed that individual that was shooting those poor individuals much sooner. In fact, our technology did just that, and now it's proliferated amongst many governments, state and local, including right here in Utah, which has been a great partner for us, and another great reason that I'm glad to be here, carrying on what this state started, but now bringing what I call tip of the spear, bleeding edge artificial intelligence and tech companies into the state. The other point I'll make is about the university and the role that it plays. While President Watkins had to leave, she has a very ambitious goal for this school. And as Dean Brown talked about, a very ambitious goal for engineering. But it's also important that we realize that it's important for us as a state to create jobs for those that we're going to bring in here and educate here in Utah so they don't leave Utah. So we can continue the great innovation of entrepreneurs here, of innovating technology here. And so hopefully each and every one of you can play a role, doesn't matter what size, but play a role in helping create jobs and keep those that are here. We heard about how many open technology jobs there are here in Utah. I know that better than anybody because I go through the pain of recruiting. We just announced hiring an additional 250 people here in the state of Utah just recently. And what we found is that we're probably 50% of the people we've hired. I think we just announced in the last 28 days, we've grown the company 33% overall, and that's in all of our locations, DC to Silicon Valley to here. That's how fast we're growing. But it's challenging here in Utah, and so we need more students to come through the University of Utah program. We need to support the university. But we also need to make sure those students stay here. So we need to support other technology companies like us coming out of Silicon Valley to grow here. It's not just about being born here, but we can move additional companies here and resources, and we can work together to make sure that the students coming through the University of Utah stay in this state so we can continue to grow together. I'll leave with the one last part about this, because I wanted to be able to allow time for the next speaker, is that I wanted to thank, while I don't know many of you, I know some of you, I wanted to thank all of you for being so welcoming in this state. It was a hard transition, not only for myself, but many of our engineers and data scientists to move from Silicon Valley and other parts of the United States to Utah. We didn't know what to expect when we got here. I can even say that some of us may have had preconceived notions of what we would expect to get here. And we came kicking and screaming, but we came. But I can tell you this, I've said this before, maybe some of you have heard me say it, I have never been accepted more in any place in my life than I have been in the state of Utah. And I really appreciate each and every one of you for the hospitality that you show others that come into the state, because it's what's going to help us continue to grow and reach all the goals that the university put up here, but also reach the goals that Lieutenant Governor just shared with us for the state. Thank you for having me tonight. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Damien. And so our final speaker for this evening is Associate Professor Cobus Vandermeer. Cobus is the J. LaPro Professor in the School of Computing at the University of Utah, and he's the director of the Flux Research Group. He has his PhD from Cambridge University, and he joined us at the University of Utah in 2012 after 14 years at AT&T Labs in New Jersey. He has won several industry awards for his work in intelligent route control and routing controllers of software-defined networks. One of the reasons we've invited Cobus here this evening is he's the PI of a recently NSF-funded project called Powder, which is a project to build a citywide wireless testbed. So with this speaker, we come full circle to the new generation of communications research here at the University of Utah. And so with that, I'd like to ask Cobus, who, there he is, sorry, I just couldn't find you there. Okay, I'll ask Cobus to come up and talk to us about Powder and wireless communication.
Thank you very much for that introduction. So I was planning to, at this point, make up a little story about why the three of us were asked to be guest speakers, but I guess you've all figured it out anyway, right? We all go to the same hairdresser. So with that, I'm mostly going to focus on the Arpanet and the beyond, and I'm going to go light on the Silicon Slopes part, but I think other speakers have handled that more than adequately. So I want to focus a little bit on the what, why, and how of the Arpanet, and then jump to a little bit more recent history, and then where we are and where we're going. And so, sorry, I'm a professor now, so I'm going to lean on my undergraduate textbook kind of heavily for this first part of the talk. It's a great book if you want to learn about networking. So, in brief, the internet history, so we're celebrating 50 years, right? And so, as you can see in this slide, well, that's when the first Arpanet node became operational. But the thing I want to point out here is that for about a decade before that, there was research leading up to this, right? So this thinking about doing networks as packet switches really started a lot earlier. And then, of course, by 1972, there was the first public demonstration on the Arpanet. And just in case you've forgotten what the picture looked like then, this is what it looked like. And by 72, this is what it looked like. Okay, so there was about 15 nodes in the Arpanet by then. So a little surprising to me, when I looked at this again, is in the decade following that, it wasn't as if, well, this was set in stone, we're going to do what we did with Arpanet. There was more research and competing research, right? So people were coming up with alternative ways of doing this. But in the end, the principles that Cerf and Kahn kind of distilled out of this exercise prevailed, and that became the internet that we have today. The next decade was mostly new protocols and more networks being added to this. And then, of course, the 90s, we got the World Wide Web, and everything exploded from there, as many of the other speakers already alluded to. And we had other applications like P2P file sharing and things like that really brought this to the attention of the general public. And then jumping forward, well, again, as everyone has said already, now everything is connected to the internet, right? In 2016, the number was 5 billion devices, probably much more by now. And by and large, well, this is a great success story, right? And these are just kind of pretty pictures of that success story. This one is the Opti project, where they looked at how traffic is routed in the internet, and you get the sense that this is an amazingly big structure that was designed by people. This is a different way of looking at it. If you look at the websites and how much traffic they collect, so this is more at the web level. Again, a very interesting map. However, it's not all good news. There's the folks at Arbor Networks have this online tool. It's at digitalattackmap.com. And their business is to look at denial of service attacks. So they have equipment distributed throughout the internet. And so they have a pretty good holistic view of what's going on in the internet. And so they have this timeline where you can see significant attacks, denial of service attacks going on in the internet. Right? And so, again, as other speakers have said, of course, not all is good with the internet. Well, so that's the first part of it, right? So that's the what. So I want to spend a little bit of time on the why. And for the why, I'm going to look at the paper that I normally look at with my graduate students. And it's the design philosophy of the DARPA Internet Protocols by David Clark. So this was published at CCOM in 1988. So in 1988, it was already written as a retroactive look on the internet and its protocols. So there's basically two things that I want to emphasize from this paper. The first one is the fundamental goal that the Arpanet had. And that goal is to facilitate effective technique for multiplexing utilization of existing interconnected networks. And that's a little, well, what do they mean with that? But basically, in essence, what they wanted to do at that point is they had two networks. They had the Arpanet, and they had an ARPA packet radio network. And their goal was to interconnect these two things, to make it into a uniform network. And they really had two choices, right? So the one choice would have been to say, let's design this as a unified system. We're gonna, everything is gonna work in a holistic way. And that's not what they did. The thing that they did was to say, we're gonna keep those networks and we're just gonna interconnect them. And so you might have heard of the internet being referred to as a network of networks, and this is the genesis of that, right? They basically, their approach was to keep these networks by and large as is and to interconnect them. The second thing I want to emphasize is in the paper, they talk about a set of second level goals. So the first goal was just this, right? Interconnect these networks. They have a set of maybe 7 second level goals. Top of that list is this quote: internet communication must continue despite loss of networks or gateways. And I want to dwell on that with you for a little bit. And in order to understand that, it's useful to think of what the state-of-the-art networks were at the time. And of course, it was the phone system. Okay? So the phone system was built of these rooms full of equipment called electronic switching systems. And this was a highly centralized design. There were very few of these electronic switching systems. The network was smart and the edge was dumb. Right? You had a dumb phone and all the intelligence was in the network. And that meant that they kept a lot of state in the network. Now, think about what they were replacing at that point in time. The first phone networks, there was an operator that would take wires and connect it in the right place. And this is what they were replacing. They were basically making that automated. So all of that state, that wire being plugged in, was automated, but it was in the network. All that state was in the network. Of course, it was single service. The only thing you can do with that, by and large, was voice. Of course, we did modems over that later on, but it was basically voice. And it was specialized hardware, right? So this is a picture that I found on the internet of one of these ESS system, 4 ESS is what it was called. And literally it was the size of a room with a bunch of equipment in there. So this might only lead us so far, but another key thing to consider that at the time we were in the Cold War. So if you think about that, you have a highly centralized system with a lot of state in the network. This is highly vulnerable to physical attack. Okay? And so that puts this quote on making sure the system can survive when parts of it is lost into perspective. So this was a key driver for the Arpanet. Okay, so how did they do it? And I'm really touching at the high end here, at the high level. So first of all, they went away from the super centralized approach where everything was in a few centralized locations. And they made it super distributed. They went from a dumb network, from a smart network to a dumb network and have the smarts at the edge. They moved the state that was previously in the network to the edge. And I want to pause on that just for a second. You know, we think about it today and it's like, it's pretty obvious that's the way you would do it. It was not obvious at the time. And if you think about it, what they said was, look, we're going to have these things at the edges, and yes, they're going to be smarter than your phone, but we're going to have enough state in them that even if the network in between were to change or to disappear, the endpoints will figure it out. We don't need the state in the network. We can keep it at the edges. It was actually a pretty radical idea. Okay, and then of course they enabled multiple services as opposed to the phone network. And then the other point is they moved to general purpose hardware with software. Okay, so this, and I took that, the fourth node, and I just blew it up, and it says PDP-10. And the PDP-10 is what we can think of today as a general purpose compute platform. And it had an operating system, and it allowed time sharing. And that allowed for great flexibility and experimentation. All right, so this is the first part of my talk. And so the key takeaway that I want you to hang on to for the rest of this is there were three things really going on here. We had a technical evolution, right? We went from dedicated hardware to general purpose hardware and software. We had a major architectural evolution. We went from the super centralized state in the network approach to having a highly distributed architecture with state at the edges. And the third thing is there was a significant driver, which was concern of the stability and the robustness of the existing state-of-the-art networks for the main threat at the time, which was big gaping hole in the ground. All right, so moving along. Oh, yes, and experimental networks made that real, and Utah played a role in that. So a little bit more recent history. So this idea of using software, general purpose hardware, it only lasted for a little bit, and then mostly for efficiency and scalability reasons, the move was back to specialized hardware. And so this photo, and I don't want to knock on Cisco at all, they're a great company, but a lot of time and energy and engineering went into building specialized hardware to build the networks that became the internet. Well, what's the problem with that? It leads to what people call ossification, right? So you have this thing that is highly specialized, highly efficient, but you can't change it. It's really hard to change. You can change at the edges because that's mostly software, but you can't change in the core. And this was a big problem. Also, the internet has become very complex, and I would suggest to you that the primary threat at this point, and it hasn't been for a long time, is not a physical threat. It's a cyber threat. Now, fortunately, most of our DDoS attacks and things of this nature, it's really in the interest of the attacker to keep the network up, right? If I want to extort a bank, well, I don't really want them to go out of business. I just want them to pay me something, right? So I want the network to be up for my business to extort money, right? Or maybe I'm just annoyed at my friend who beat me at a game and I want to attack them or something like that. But by and large, I want the network to stay up. This is not necessarily true if you have a nation state that doesn't have that in their interest, right? So this is, I think, our major threat at this point in time. One more thing about recent history. So we're mostly talking about the internet, of course, but there is this other set of networks that, by and large, developed in their own universe, parallel universe, mobile networks. And if we look at the mobile networks state of the art today, 4G networks, they're packet-based. They kind of look a little bit like the internet. But if you look under the hood, that heritage of a telco network with state in the network, with connections in the network, is still very much visible in those networks. And of course, and there's a little bit of a separate issue, but we allocate spectrum in these chunks, whether they're being used or not, so it's actually a pretty inefficient way of dealing with that. All right, so this brings me to the where are we now? And I would suggest to you that we're really mostly in the same place, or in a similar place at least. I think we're at a technical evolution whereby networks have been softwareized and virtualized. So in the last 10 to maybe 15 years, there's been a big push first to do software-defined networking, where those big Cisco boxes that I showed you were torn apart, as it were, and the software was taken out. And the idea was, well, the hardware is doing what the hardware does. It's fast, it's very efficient, but the software, we want to take the software out so that we can modify that, we can innovate. And that took us quite a bit down the road of innovation, but at some point, pretty soon actually, they realized that, well, we really want to change the hardware too, right? Just saying that, well, the hardware does what the hardware does is not good. We want to change that too. And so we have two ways in which that is being done today or emerging. One is called network function virtualization. And that's back to the idea of saying general purpose compute, functionality provided by software. The second way in which this is being done is by a technology called data plane programmability, where you have general purpose, and now it's questionable at this point whether it's general purpose or not, but you have general purpose hardware that is built for networking, but it can take software to define its functionality. Right? So it's actually very innovative stuff. The final thing that I would, and it's probably not quite in the same category as the others, is that there's a major push for open source stacks in networking. This is something that was just simply not true 10 years ago. And this is not just for your academics or your hobbyists, right? You have major technology companies that are pushing towards making their networks software and doing that with open source software. This is an amazing change in our industry. All right. The second thing is, I think we still have, or we again rather have, a major architectural evolution. So I talked about the internet and mobile networks, and I'd say by and large, the distinction between those are disappearing. It's all just software at this point. If you look at 5G, so 5G has a service-based architecture. It looks more like web and cloud than it does a mobile core network. We have slicing or virtualization as a core primitive in mobile networking in 5G. We have multiple service abstractions. The radio access network, the piece between your device and the cell tower, is being virtualized and made programmable. And then, just in case there's a couple of ECE guys that slipped in, of course, things in wireless will always be a little different. You have to do with spectrum and efficient waveforms and antenna systems and things that are not software. Finally, I would say we have concerns. I mean, given the fact that we rely on these networks so heavily, there are concerns about, do we have the expertise that we need? Are they stable enough? Are they robust enough? And so there's a couple of initiatives, mostly from government agencies, to address this. One is NSF, of course, where we get a lot of our research money from. FCC has a number of really interesting initiatives around making spectrum innovation easier. And then DARPA is still there, right? DARPA is still funding network innovation, both in terms of spectrum use and also using commercial technology in non-commercial settings. All right, so where are we going? And I want to finish up last part of my talk by talking of three initiatives, or two initiatives rather, and one related one around the FCC designation of Powder as an innovation zone. So I'm going to spend most of the rest of my talk talking about Powder. Powder is a platform for open wireless data-driven experimental research. We have a joint, or it's a project with our partners at Rice University, and their part of the project is called Renew. So a little bit of background. Powder Renew is a project that is part of the NSF POWER initiative, Platforms for Advanced Wireless Research. And this is basically one of those initiatives where NSF is saying, we really need, as a nation, to do more hands-on research associated with mobile and wireless networks. And the way they chose to do that is to create this program as a private-public partnership and to use that to fund what they call 4 city-scale platforms. And so Powder is one of those platforms which we're building here in Salt Lake City on the campus and out to the downtown area. And we have Renew as a technology partner in that. There's another platform being built in New York, and they just announced a third winner in the second round of competition that's in North Carolina. All right, so this is the Powder big picture. See if I can, is this working? No? Okay. So I'll just wave my hands at you. So this is high level, and if you look at this is basically what a cellular network looks like. Okay, so we have what we call stationary radios. Think of these as rooftop deployments of wireless equipment. From there, we have essentially a fiber front haul, back haul network to what we call an edge compute location. It's a location where we have a bunch of computers. Really high capacity, really low latency between those rooftop nodes and the edge compute. So from there, we go to Metro Cloud. We have a cloud research facility run by Rob Ricci, my colleague, called Cloud Lab, which is in the University of Utah Downtown Data Center. Then, of course, we connect to the rest of the world. So that's sort of from the stationary radios up. In terms of endpoints, so if you think about it, if you want to build a test bed for mobility, well, you need endpoints. And ideally, they should move around. And so the way that we're going to make them move around is to put endpoints on buses, on shuttles, on campus. Because buses have this nice property that they do the same route over and over again, right? And so we get repeatability out of that. We also have what we call fixed endpoints, and these are just locations that sort of human height attached to buildings. And then we'll have endpoints on other things like the golf carts that drive around campus, and with our city partners, some of their vehicles as well. And we'll have portable versions of this in addition. So the key thing about this infrastructure is that it's software defined end-to-end. So from the endpoints to the base station, to the network, to the cloud, it's all software defined. So in the radio access network, so between the endpoints and the stationary radio, we do that with software defined radios. And that means that it's a general purpose piece of hardware that you can slap different pieces of software on and make that into either a 4G network or a 5G network, or maybe not a G at all. Maybe it's some experimental network, right? And when you build a test bed or a platform, this is actually crucial. It would have been a lot easier for us if we just build a 5G network, because then we knew this is the specific thing that we're building. But we want to do all of that. We want to be 4G and 5G and 6G and whatever. And the way to do that is by being software-defined end-to-end. We've mostly focused on the things circled here. The putting devices on buses is our big push for the next year. This is the area that we will be deploying in. So we started on campus. Oops, wrong way, sorry. And then with the red area, we will have what we call a dense deployment, sort of close to the hospital, probably next year, and then move our way towards the downtown area over the next 2 years. This is, and I'm not going to go into the detail here, but just to give you a sense of what these things look like. This is meant to be a cell phone. It's a little bigger than your cell phone. Well, in my defense, we have a couple of cell phones in there, or a couple of cell phones worth of logic in there. But the point is, this is a software-defined, actually it's a couple of software-defined radios with compute coupled together in that box. And again, that gives us that flexibility that this endpoint could become different things at different times. This is a picture of one of our rooftop nodes, or actually 2 of our rooftop nodes. Again, we have 4 software-defined radios in there, 2 antennas, 1 broadband antenna, 1 bandit antenna. And then the network from those rooftops back to our near edge compute is basically a private fiber network, and we run CWDM over that. So each of the SDRs get essentially a 10 gig link from the SDR to a compute node. We have a control framework whereby we can pair these things up dynamically depending on what you want and when you want it. We also have a massive MIMO system. This is the technology that we're getting from our Renew partners. So this Rice University did a lot of work on massive MIMO. They actually have a startup company that built the hardware, and they're building the software for us to handle that. So each of the little green boxes is a card with 2 transceivers, 2 radios on them. They build it in such a way that you can daisy chain those radios, and then you have a hub whereby you daisy chain the hubs. You daisy chain the daisy change, and there you have it. You have a 64 antenna massive MIMO system. So the goal with massive MIMO, and I'm not a massive MIMO expert, is you have lots of antennas, and this allows you to steer your beam towards where you want it to go, right? So you get, rather than sending a very broad radio signal, you send a very narrow signal, and you can send it where you want to go, and so you get much more efficient use of your spectrum. We have lots of software. We mostly do open source software, and again, I'll just point out here, we have 4G, we have the beginnings of 5G, although that's fairly immature at this point. I'm going to pause on this just for a little bit. When you build a wireless network, spectrum is a big deal. So we have, I mentioned FCC initiatives to make innovation in this space easier. The first one is a program license. Basically just allows you, if you have an electronic or electrical engineering department, you can get one of these. Makes it easier for you to do experimentation. The big one for us, and we got designated by the FCC as such, is an innovation zone. And we got designated just a couple of weeks ago, one of the first 2 in the nation. And the big deal with that is, again, that it allows more flexibility in the use of spectrum. It doesn't mean we can now go stomp on AT&T or, we still have to abide by FCC regulations, but we have more freedom in terms of what we can do with that. With this infrastructure, we think we can support a pretty broad range of research from low-level wireless all the way to applications. And of course, this involves lots and lots of partners, both on campus and off campus. I'll just pause on this for a second. We're also involved in a new project called Fabric. It's an NSF mid-scale project. And it's basically to build a fully programmable fabric across the nation. So our involvement is mostly to connect the two platforms that I talked about earlier, Powder and Cloud Lab, to this programmable infrastructure that is being built. And if it's not obvious to you, I just flashed this Arpanet slide there, and the similarity should be obvious. And I'll point out that Utah is, I think, one of a few that is present on both of these maps. All right. To wrap up, again, my thesis to you is that we're pretty much in the same place or a similar place where we were 50 years ago, except, of course, technology has moved on, but we have technology evolution, we have architectural evolution, and there is a drive driven by the concerns about our nation's expertise and concerns about the robustness of its infrastructure. And of course, we're building the experimental networks to make that real, and Utah is again in the midst of that. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Cobus, and thanks to all the speakers this evening. I appreciate all the time and for all of you for coming, and have a good evening. And I think that with that, we'll conclude the whole meeting. So thanks.